Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Murph McCarthy. I'm also on the Stockdale Center staff, and it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker. Lieutenant General John E. Wissler is currently the Deputy Commandant for Programs and Resources. And based on some of our discussions we've had here in the last 2 days, that is the Marine in charge with doing a lot with a little. General Wissler can be best described as a warrior, strategist, and scholar. He has led and commanded from the platoon level to the Marine Expeditionary Force level. His most recent fleet tours include commanding the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, as well as Deputy Commander of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. And the word on the street is that he is going to be the next 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force Commander. Congratulations, sir. As a strategist, he has been the senior military assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Marine Corps aide to 2 U.S. presidents, and the director of the Marine Corps Initiatives Group. As a scholar, he is a distinguished graduate of the Naval Academy, the Air Force Institute of Technology, and the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant John Wissler, class of 1978.
Just for a second, General Wissler. The reason when Murph said that General Wissler is going to command the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force on Okinawa, this is the big, we talked about society and classes. All of our Marine Expeditionary Force commanders have been either aviation, helicopter pilots or fixed wing pilots, or infantry or artillery. This will be the first time the Marine Corps has recognized the talent, and the superb talent, earned not given, of a logistician. General Wissler is a combat engineer by trade, but we take all of those MOSs and we put them in a group called logisticians when they get so senior. But that's why when Murph called that out, he's broken through the glass ceiling and he leads all those logisticians, now giving them the opportunity to command at the Marine Expeditionary Force level. So very special man here. Really looking forward to a great talk. I put the monkey on your back. Don't let me down.
Roger that, sir. First of all, it's just an honor to be here and speak again. I had the honor to come about 2 years ago and talk to midshipmen primarily on an evening. Had written some ethics papers and got a chance to review some of the finalists and come talk about what I thought about leadership, and I'd much rather do that than talk about money, but those weren't the questions you asked me. So unlike congressional testimony, I'll actually answer the questions that I'm asked. It's great to have those great words by General Sattler, who was Assistant Division Commander when I was a young second lieutenant or lieutenant colonel battalion commander, and Dr. O'Connell was one of my second lieutenant platoon commanders, and we both are much better off for the leadership of General Sattler. And then I had the fortune of serving under General Sattler in combat in Iraq in 2005, and I'm a much better officer, and I would offer probably one of the reasons the Commandant decided to let me be a MEF commander was because of mentorship by General Sattler and others. It's also inspiring to be here, be surrounded by what I would call many important and indeed critical individuals. You are all dedicated to the training and education of what I consider the most valuable investment in our country, and that's young men and women of our all-volunteer force. Your students are an exceptional group of young Americans, many of whom have chosen to and demonstrated the capacity to lead the young men and women of our armed forces. And in any case, whether your students are civilians or military members, they will, in the years to come, contribute to prodigious decisions that demand the highest levels of professional competence. They must be prepared during one of the most formidable periods, and I think in our nation's history, to fulfill the role that our country hopes, in fact needs, in fact probably demands from them. If they're in the military, they have to work from a foundation of not only strategy and tactics and logistics, but they also have to understand economics. They have to understand politics. They have to understand diplomacy. And they have to understand all of that in a framework of history. They must be prepared to play a constructive role, and that constructive role is in the development of national policy. national policy that will protect our interests, protect our security, and protect the engine for peace in the world. And I think that engine for peace is economic freedom and sustainability. So my challenge to you at the outset is you need to teach them well. Military service by its nature, and I don't have to say this to anybody in this group, but it's tough, it's dangerous, and it extracts a routinely high price for success. Wherever these students will serve, whatever their mission, whatever their role in life, the men and women of our armed forces continue to be ready. They're motivated and eager, and their professionalism and patriotism is undimmed after 10+ years of combat. It's a pretty amazing thing to think that 10 years in the toughest crucible of life has not dimmed their outlook. They carry a timeless ethos and a deep pride that's built over 237 years of service to the nation. And my focus today in this discussion about economics is really going to be about the nation and shared sacrifice. The Defense Department remains fully engaged in executing our current defense strategic guidance, now just a little bit over a year old. But it can't be avoided. We've entered an era of budget austerity, and that period of budget austerity impacts not only the military, but it in fact impacts our nation. Pressure's been building, particularly in the public debate over the last few years, that we need substantial reductions in defense spending. I think partly because we've had rising government debt. And the other part is that there's this rising expectation that as we wind down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that will allow us to cut back and still maintain the security that we have as a nation. Ultimately, the final outcome of this expectation for reductions remains very uncertain. For not only are we in a period of austerity, but we're in a significant period of fiscal uncertainty. We just got the fiscal year 13 budget. The fiscal year 14 budget is on the Hill. For people who know how we build budgets in the Pentagon, we do not have fiscal guidance for a budget that technically is due on 1 August this year. We are way behind where we should be to make major decisions about the future, and I'll explain in the follow-on some of the causes for that uncertainty. And while defense spending has been sort of the public argument about where we can take these cuts, I would offer that the federal government's deficit requires difficult decisions and cuts across all of federal spending, to include defense. Defense is not excluded from this. There's no doubt that defense must be part of the solution in reducing our national debt. We, those who wear the cloth of our nation, regardless of the service, we have an obligation for reducing the national debt. We, as American citizens, have an obligation to take every action possible to alleviate our debt. I would offer that that debt is the greatest threat to our nation. The Department of Defense has already, in fact, begun to act in reducing the reducing that deficit in the FY14 budget. We did that while trying to protect critical warfighting and forward deployed capabilities, but we couldn't do that to the fullest extent possible. As we move further into this new fiscal environment, our fiscal plans and our programs must continue to balance force structure, readiness, and capability, the capability to meet national security commitments with the need for reduced spending. You see, it's defining that balance between ends, ways, and means that remains the elusive challenge of additional reductions. So in the broadest sense, where are we? The United States federal budget has experienced significant growth over the past decade. The $2.3 trillion budget, with a T, trillion, presented to Congress in 2004 has now grown to a $3.8 trillion budget in 2014. 65% growth in the federal budget. So keep in mind that 65% number. Beyond simple growth, since fiscal year 2002, spending has exceeded revenue. This annual budget deficit condition dramatically increased over time, and in fiscal year 2009, for the first time in our nation's history, our debt topped $1 trillion. It's remained at an annual rate above $1 trillion ever since. While the national budget has grown at 65% in the past 10 years, defense spending actually has risen 39%. Perhaps less well known is the fact that a number of other non-defense discretionary accounts have actually outpaced DOD growth. Department of Veterans Affairs has seen a 126% increase. Department of State, USAID, has seen a 74% increase. The Department of Homeland Security has expanded by 46%. Due to the nature and the mission of these departments, it's not wholly unexpected in this period of war on global terror that they would see those kinds of increases. But other discretionary accounts in our government have in fact seen greater growth than the Department of Defense. The Department of Commerce grew 59%. Department of Housing and Urban Development, 52% growth. Department of Justice, 56%. And the Department of Transportation witnessed a 41% increase. All other departments not previously mentioned have grown somewhere between 5 and 38% as their share of the government budget. What's not widely known in that is that while the Department of Defense grew that 39%, that equated to $146.7 billion over that 10-year period. But the remainder of growth, the growth in the rest of the government, actually eclipsed, in dollars, growth by the Department of Defense, growing to $175.2 billion since 2004. Nearly $30 billion more than the defense budget grew. So you see, growth is not unique to the Department of Defense, and I would offer highlights the need, as I mentioned earlier, for a balanced approach to government-wide cuts. Simply, all areas of the budget must be reviewed for potential savings. So I shared with you the numbers and the growth. What's behind the numbers? Why are reductions so hard for the Department of Defense? Many would say we've been here before. We've been in this situation before. I would offer that that's not necessarily the case. For starters, we remain at war. Unlike any other period of downturn in our history, we have either the war has ended or our enemy, as it was the case in the Cold War, was no longer the enemy. Taking the most recent case coming out of the Cold War, in the 1980s, the defense buildup in the 1980s was primarily about equipment. It was primarily about procurement of things for the service. And so that drawdown that began in the 1990s started with a significantly recapitalized inventory of ships, planes, aircraft, and our combat vehicles. These Reagan-era investments, however, are rapidly becoming ineffective. They're reaching the end of their service life and they must be replaced. Modernizing these aging systems is going to require considerable resources. And the cost of modernization has increased. The figures I'm about to give you are inside the Marine Corps, but they're relative to every one of the services. It costs 5.5 times as much to outfit an individual Marine today as it did in the year 2000. It costs 5.5 times as much to outfit an individual Marine, his helmet, his body armor, his weapon, his uniform, than it did in the year 2000. That does not include his night vision goggles. If I threw those in, the cost is actually more. And now every Marine who leaves a perimeter has a set of night vision goggles. In the day of Lieutenant Colonel Wissler and Lieutenant O'Connell, we had sets for certain individuals in the organization. It costs 3.2 times as much to outfit an infantry battalion. That's taking out the cost of the people, their communications equipment, and the things that are associated exclusive of their vehicles. And it costs 5.5 times to put a combat vehicle in place today as it did in fiscal year 2000. That's the cost of protection against our most current and most ominous threat, the improvised explosive device. So as you can see, the cost to replace what we have is significantly greater than the 65% growth in the budget. In addition to this cost of new equipment, sustained combat operations in the harsh environments of Iraq and Afghanistan have used up the service life of our equipment. So as we bring this equipment back, it's in fact aged faster than we had originally intended it to age. And so things that we thought would last well into the mid-2020s are now coming to the end of their service life due to the extensive use in the harsh environment that they've been forced to undergo. Our budgets must fund the reset and restoration of that old equipment and at the same time simultaneously procure new equipment, ensuring we provide our men and women the most combat-ready equipment they need to respond not only today, but to the future crisis that they may have to respond to. While our armed forces, and I mean this sincerely across all of the services, are known for innovative warfighting approaches and can-do leadership, these characteristics cannot overcome the vulnerabilities that are created by rapidly aging fleets of ships, vehicles, systems, and aircraft. Shortfalls in modernization will have an immediate impact on readiness, and they will ultimately cost lives on the battlefield. At some point, sustaining fleets of severely worn vehicles becomes increasingly inefficient and no longer cost-effective. The inefficiency reduces available modernization resources from already strained accounts and then degrades our ability to effectively operate both in today's environment and the environment of tomorrow. Compounding our inability to modernize an aging and war-torn set of equipment is the systematic growth in the cost of new equipment. I mentioned the figures earlier. The natural question that would come to you is why? Why does it cost so much to replace that worn out and aged equipment? The answer is twofold. First, analysis shows that the developmental cost in the past 3 decades has remained high without any sign of improvement. This is not a new phenomenon that was brought on by the fact that we had money available due to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a 3-decade-old problem. Despite a decade of acquisition reform and other significant management initiatives, and they have been significant, the development of the cost of military systems just continues to grow. This is not an indictment of the government acquisition process, although there is always room for improvement there. But it's the ever-increasing complexity of the technology, the software density, and the system integration requirements that make estimating the total cost of any system very, very difficult, and most difficult to do at the inception of major equipment and procurement development projects. When comparing defense procurement programs to public work projects, if you want to compare it to other major expenditures in our country, projects of similar scale, weapon system total cost growth proves higher than that of rail, fixed link, or road projects. The difference is understandable. The difference is in the technologies. The technologies related to infrastructure projects are thoroughly understood and include a conservative, in fact, evolutionary adaptation of new technology over time. In contrast, most Department of Defense developmental programs involve significantly higher levels of new technology, of new adaptation, and they result in inherently higher levels of both cost and schedule uncertainty. I come back to that word uncertainty. Uncertainty drives cost into both our budgets, the way we execute the money we have, but also drives cost into the procurement of long-term programs. Second, as DOD continues to strive to do better to control cost, and they do so by attacking over-optimism in schedule, estimating errors, unrecognized technical issues, they're attacking requirements creep and a lack of incentives to control cost or schedule and excessive tests. They're attacking that full spectrum of root causes, but arresting cost growth is essential yet exceptionally difficult because of the process within which they have to work. We actually have to have a better process to predict the cost before we make those long-term decisions. And that's the second piece of why it's so difficult in controlling costs. So I've talked about the cost of things, but things are in fact not what makes the Department of Defense. People are the Department of Defense. The cost of people is exacerbating the cost of things in these periods of decreasing budgets. The cost of military pay and allowances combined with military health care comprises about 1/3 of the Department of Defense's budget. Approximately $180 billion this year. These costs have been growing rapidly in recent years, up almost 90% since fiscal year 2001. That represents a growth 30% greater than the growth of inflation. While active duty end strength in that same period has only grown by 3%. If these costs are allowed to continue rising at their current rate, they will consume the entire defense budget by the year 2039. If DOD cannot control the growth in military personnel costs by changing the compensation system, we will have little choice but to either excessively reduce people or reach into already underfunded modernization and readiness accounts. Over time, this limits both the capability and the capacity of our military, and if left unchecked, will leave us with a military too small and or too unprepared for even the most basic missions of national defense. The Pentagon's personnel budget is composed of three major pieces: pay, health care, and retirement. The rapid growth in each of these programs presents a serious obstacle to bringing defense spending under control, especially in light of the significant increases that have occurred over the past decade. These significant costs are part and parcel to maintaining an all-volunteer force that has performed actually superbly in the last 10 years of combat. If you go back to the inception of the all-volunteer force in 1973, it was never intended that that force would, by and of itself, fight extended national conflict. And we've now been in a war for over 10, I would offer over 11 years. Since 2000, the active duty compensation, pay basically, exclusive of health care, has increased by 28%, with the cost per service member growing from an average of about $64,500 in 2000 to over $80,000 in 2012. This growth is partially attributable to special pays associated with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but is really fundamentally a result of repeated increases in basic pay that have been authorized by the Congress. To ensure that our force attracts and retains the highest quality recruits, the Defense Department ties basic military pay to the Employment Cost Index. That ensures that our members are paid in line with their comparably educated civilian counterparts. In 2004, however, Congress mandated that military pay increases would be done by the Employment Cost Index, the ECI, plus 0.5% through the year of 2006. And in fact, that's been the standard ever since. They did that contrary to the Pentagon's budget submissions through fiscal year 2013. These extra inflationary increases continued despite the fact that the Department of Defense in that same period had met their recruiting and retention goals. And why is that important? Compensation is intended to retain the best all-volunteer force we can. And without the extra inflationary pay raises, we were already retaining a very capable and very vibrant military. Repeated pay raises above the Pentagon's requests have driven military pay out of line with our own standards. By 2006, the average service member enlisted made $5,400 a year more than his civilian counterpart. And the average officer made about $6,000 a year more than his civilian counterpart. Now I have to stop here and take stock. The sacrifice that both officers and enlisted service members make is priceless. And balanced against the freedom they secure, it's very difficult to determine what's a fair price. But what is known is that this compensation level is unsustainable given the current period of austerity. And all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have testified to that fact before Congress. As a mentor of both General Sattler and I told us once, the best quality of life is coming home alive. Pay is not everything there is to a viable military. And if you were to ask a young Marine, they would probably tell you they'd rather have the ammunition and the ability to train and take a slightly lower pay raise in the next fiscal year budget. Repeatedly raising basic pay is fiscally unsustainable. It ignores the best advice of military leadership and recommendations of the Pentagon's own commission, such as the Quadrennial Review of Military Compensation. The military must also restrain runaway health care costs. The need for military health care reform is undeniable. Between fiscal year 2001 and 2012, the military health care budget grew by nearly 300%, and it now consumes almost 10% of the DOD budget. That's more than the entire budget of the United States Marine Corps. Most of the cost growth stems not from providing care for active duty troops, but from caring for the nation's military retirees and their dependents. Our men and women in uniform and our veterans and our nation's military retirees deserve access to top quality pay, don't get me wrong, and they need top quality health care. But in these times of fiscal austerity, it's important to evaluate the effectiveness of these personnel programs against the long-term health of national security. The threat that mounting personnel costs pose to the military has repeatedly gained the attention of the most senior leaders in the military. And in the 2013 budget request, the department proposed changes to military compensation that would have represented just 1/10 of the BCA Budget Control Act imposed $492 billion budget reductions. Yet many of these proposals were rejected by Congress in the fiscal year 2013 National Defense Authorization Act. In fiscal year 2014, the Defense Department resubmitted a new package of military compensation proposals, took into consideration the concerns from Congress, but still maintained an attempt to bring down the cost of personnel. None of the new proposals result in any reduction in pay or benefits. They simply reduce the rate of growth of those benefits. Specific proposals include modest reductions in the growth of military pay, recommending a 1% pay raise for the military. A modest additional increase in TRICARE, pharmacy, and copays. Where applicable, these fees are phased in, they have maximum limits, and even in some cases, they're grandfathered. Admittedly, trying to decide an appropriate level of compensation for those who risk their lives in the service of our country and their fellow citizens is a difficult task. In deciding how much is enough, the government simply must keep this in mind. It must be enough to ensure that it recruits and, more importantly, retains sufficient numbers of qualified service members. Succeeding in this balance ensures a ready force and a continuation of the all-volunteer force. However, sacrifices must be made. With the preceding discussion of the budget as background, one can surmise that the obligation to alleviate this debt is in fact shared across the entirety of government. Required reforms are difficult. They're difficult from an intellectual perspective, and they're difficult from a political perspective. Many of these reforms have been suggested or attempted in the past, only to be overlooked or avoided because of their complexity or because of their challenge to existing practices. Tackling these challenges is not new, and it demands a balanced approach. And the balanced approach is not new. In fact, this approach is the guidance that was established in our Constitution. The same Constitution that every member swears an oath to uphold and defend. Every member of the military, officer or enlisted, at every re-enlistment or every promotion, reaffirms that oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution states this: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The highest law of the land does not state a requirement to provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare, but rather to provide and promote both. It also states in Article 1, Section 8, that the Congress shall raise and support armies and provide and maintain a navy and make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To attempt anything less than a balanced reduction actually then flies in the face of the supreme law of our nation. In fact, before this latest budget crisis, the Defense Department was already working hard to manage resources more efficiently and achieve better stewardship of the budgets we had been given. And in fact, the budget that is currently on the Hill with the President took $487 billion out of our previous top line across a 10-year period, and did so at some significant risk, but maintained what the Joint Chiefs felt was both a strong and a capable force for the future. The Secretary of Defense has called this combination of belt-tightening and refocusing hard but manageable. As someone who was engaged in many of the deliberations that took place to produce the fiscal year 2014 budget, I can vouch for it. It was hard, but in the end, it was manageable. So now we face sequestration. The budget reductions dictated by the Budget Control Act of 2011 have caused us to look at additional cuts. Sequestration is not a next fiscal year problem. Unfortunately, the fiscal year 2014 programs will be significantly and adversely affected by sequester-induced budget cuts in fiscal year 2013. Training cutbacks, civilian furloughs or the potential of civilian furloughs, deferral of equipment and facilities maintenance, reductions to energy conservation investments, contract inefficiencies, and curtailed deployments have all occurred in this fiscal year, and they will have rippling effects into 2014. To address the draconian impacts of sequestration, the recently submitted President's budget includes a combination of increased revenues and $120 billion reduction across that 5-year period for the Department of Defense. The President deems that this is sufficient to meet the requirements of the Budget Control Act and to, in fact, replace and repeal the sequester-related reductions that would take place in 2014 and beyond. And there are other budget proposals that are being worked. In our legislative branch, Senator Murray has put forth a program similar to the President's, but calls for a $240 billion reduction in that same 10-year period to the Department of Defense. If any of these proposals, however, fail to become an appropriation by the 1st of October of this year, then full sequester meaning a $492 billion reduction, will take place in the Department of Defense over the next 9 years. From a service perspective, this translates to a $2.5 billion cut from the current budget that's on the Hill that the service chiefs have been testifying to over the last couple of weeks. And continued reductions that average almost $2.4 billion for the remainder of that 9-year period. To put that in perspective for you, the entire Marine Corps' procurement budget for fiscal year 2013 was $2.57 billion. And while we won't take it all out of our procurement account, you can at least see the size of the challenge that faces the Marine Corps And I am only an example of what faces a challenge to the Navy, to the Army, and to the Air Force. Last month, in an attempt to frame potential solutions of this, Secretary Hagel launched what he called the Strategic Choices and Management Review. It's an ongoing process that's going to help define the major decisions that must be made to shape the decade ahead and preserve and adapt our defense strategy. And he's done it under a range of future strategic and budgetary scenarios, ranging from the president's budget that's on the Hill to the full sequester of $492 billion. This review is scheduled to be complete in early June, and after that we will get fiscal guidance for POM 15, a budget that's due in August. Our best estimate is we will have 6 weeks to do what we can normally takes more than 6 months. I truly believe for these reasons that we stand at a critical crossroads today in our country. Despite the beginnings of a drawdown over a decade of war, we continue to face very real challenges to our national security. And we remain engaged around the globe and in some places in combat operations. In addition to the continued threat of terrorist attack, we encounter the pressure caused by instability in Iran and North Korea, turmoil across the Middle East and North Africa, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorist activity in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and the growing threat of cyber attacks. Simultaneously, we continue to emerge from the recent economic recession while grappling with record debt and a deficit that I've described earlier. How we confront this austerity, how we deal with this fiscal uncertainty will in many ways determine the future course of America. It will determine whether the United States remains a leader in the 21st century or whether we begin the slide to marginalization on the global stage. To succeed, we must depend on the resilience of our economy, the strength of our diplomatic system, and our military institutions, and above all, we must rely on an effective political system that underpins in many ways everything we can actually accomplish as a country. Most importantly, we must embrace shared sacrifice. As the nation prepares for an uncertain future, the armed forces will unfailingly maintain their obligation to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Debt being, I would offer, one of those domestic enemies. In the execution of these duties, we will continue to provide best military advice. Advice to include the impacts of budget decisions on our readiness to meet the national security needs of the country. Advice that includes the impacts of budget decisions on our overall national security. And in my specific case, the ability to define the best Marine Corps that the nation can afford. While you can be certain that the military will uphold these obligations, we merely ask that the nation uphold its obligation to the all-volunteer military that they have chosen. Continue to keep in mind these young men and women in uniform deployed in harm's way, for they are the reason for the budget. Support those who have committed their lives to support and defend the Constitution, and especially those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. We cannot take their readiness nor the readiness of the future force for granted. Without the resources to train and equip our force, our young men and women will ultimately pay the price, and they may ultimately pay that price with their lives. As citizens, we must all, military and civilians, share in hardship of austerity. During times of war, one might have thought that this hardship would require sustained and large-scale national commitment. If you're a student of history, you would have assumed so. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "War costs money." He went on to say, that means taxes and bonds and taxes. It means cutting luxuries and other non-essentials. This has not been the case over the last 11 plus years. As a result, I'm reminded of a poem etched into an old sentry box at Gibraltar, which states, "God and the soldier all men adore, in time of trouble and no more. For when it is over and all things righted, God is neglected and the old soldier sliding. We cannot allow the soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, young or old, to be slighted. It is imperative to either become part of the process that solves this dilemma or accept the results. I've appreciated the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I want to thank all of you again because I think you hold a great responsibility in educating our young men and women about their responsibilities of the future. The challenge is to be prepared and to minimize the damage to our nation until we can get back to a more stable place in our economy, and we need to do that together. God bless each and every one of you, and Semper Fi. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, have at 'em.
General, I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. And earlier this week, I heard Admiral Burke sort of roll out, I guess what I would call the new organization of the Navy in terms of moving piece parts around and how you have to bring them. One of the things that struck me is in the military, we don't seem to, in fact, I would say our entire educational system, we don't teach complexity, except we live in an unbelievably complex world, and we look for simple solutions. So we don't find an easy way to even explain the stories. I think part of the educational system is to make sure that kids that come out of college can write clear, concise, compelling stories at an 11-year-old level. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of, if you want to educate the American public, it has to be written that way, and without jargon words. I mean, lawyers write for lawyers, political science write for political scientists, and you can't understand what they're saying. And I think that's a terribly important thing if we want to explain the major changes that we're going to have to make so that you get support for them. And there's so many components of this. It's really quite stunning. I mean, one of the things we did in defense was when the veterans cost got so high, we just took it off the budget and created a new department. You know, one could say, well, let's take all the health care costs off and put it in a new department so our bill doesn't look so high. And balancing out for military health care costs, so many of them get out and then get fancy jobs, certainly at the top level, and then get health care costs covered by their corporations as well. Some of this ought to be examined in a way to try to figure out what makes sense. It's not a question, it's an observation. And you know, I was lucky enough to be the first female political appointee at the Navy, and I'm a social anthropologist by training, so I spend my time observing that change.
Thank you. There was, I believe it's in the fiscal year 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, a requirement to do exactly what you're talking about. There's a commission on compensation, the members of which have not been picked by responsible members of our government to who that will be, but their task is to do exactly as you stated, to find out how we can attack these challenges. The very thing you offer, where if you have a job and you have other health care, why would you have the other health care and tackle that problem? The real challenge, though, the lens through which we need to make all those decisions is the readiness lens. And can we continue to sustain an all-volunteer force in perpetuity? Or make the other decision, which is we go back to a conscripted force. And I don't know how much stomach there is in America for an all-conscripted force right now either. So the balance of that becomes the challenge. And thank God I'm not going to be anywhere near qualified to sit on the commission.
Sir. Sir, Kyle Agee from Army G2. I was a recruiting battalion commander, and if I had LA, and I got to say, we had a real tough time against your recruiters because you had Pendleton right there, and your recruiters would take candidates down to Pendleton, and they'd come back all fired up, and somehow we took our guys to Fort Irwin. They weren't exactly ready to sign. But
no water.
But being that as it may, you know, I was very disheartened when sequestration kicked in, and one of the first things we did was suspend tuition assistance, because on my watch, my recruiters had used that as an incentive, and I felt, you know, more than a decade removed, that we had reneged on a commitment. So the larger question with a volunteer force, and you talked about that several times, conclude at the end here. When you're looking for ways to economize, how do you balance what might make economic sense versus commitments we've made both to soldiers and Marines and Airmen currently in the force and those who have already served with a certain understanding of what their benefits for life were going to be?
Sure. We led the charge against taking tuition assistance back. We did it after a lot of very deliberate discussion, and it kind of boiled down to this. As we surveyed those who were using tuition assistance, we found that the reason they were getting their degree on tuition assistance is they wanted to save their GI Bill to give to their kids or their wife for their degrees. And while we fully support the education of our service members, we weren't about paying the money necessary to educate them and their spouse and their children and or their children. Our long term, that was a 1-year savings because fiscal year 13 was an absolute train wreck from the very beginning. But our intention is to modify tuition assistance or attempt to do so that the career Marine has an opportunity then to attain and go to college. What we found out is that our youngest of Marines, the ones you're talking about that you get in the door, don't really even have an opportunity at tuition assistance if they're in any unit that's going to the fight, which for the past 10 years has been most of them, until about their 3rd year in school. At that point, should they choose, they could use their GI Bill, although that's not recommended. Our point would be to wait till they were in their 2nd enlistment and then use that to educate the career force, or what has a better chance of being the career force, as opposed to giving that college degree and then that GI Bill, which is identified for that individual, comes in for 4 years and leaves to get his education. So we were trying to find that balance between the needs of the Marine Corps and the needs of the individual. We were unsuccessful. Congress told us to put the money back. We did. Just to put it in context, that money was the money we needed to, we found other savings, but in terms of I shouldn't say savings, other sacrifice. That was the money it cost us to send the Marines who about 3 days ago arrived in Darwin, Australia for 6 months of their deployment and to train with the Australians, the Indonesians, and the Malaysians. It was not a casual decision. It was a decision of maintaining our forward deployed readiness and our ability to influence around the globe.
General, you've described a strange environment to me where our senior military leaders and senior defense civilians have asked for a sustainable fiscal future for the force, and the congressional appropriators have refused to take that advice. And my students ask this question often, and I can't help but answer. The only answer I have is that too many of our congressional appropriators view defense spending as a jobs program. And I'm wondering, do I have it too simple? Is that too crass and crude? Because I don't want to breed cynicism, but I can't understand why those who are charged with deciding on spending are making choices that are obviously fiscally unsustainable. And I see direct benefits accruing to their districts.
I think as it pertains to compensation of our Marines, the pay raise piece that I talked about, and that's every service, I can speak for what I know. And I do a lot of interaction with the professional staff on the Hill. They see maintaining that level of compensation as taking care of the force. We are having a much more challenging time describing for them that idea of the best quality of life is coming home alive. We've done a little bit better job of it, I think, in the last 18 months in the Marine Corps because we totally restructured how we look at readiness. So we look at readiness in the Marine Corps now across what we call 5 pillars of readiness. And the first pillar is high quality people. That high quality person requires education, training, a compensation package, but we balance that as one of 5 pillars against the second pillar, which is what would traditionally be known in English or worn uniform, unit readiness, the amount of gear you have, the money you have to train with, and the maintenance and all those sorts of things. The third pillar is our ability to respond to what the combatant commanders require us to do around the globe. So do we have enough of a Marine Corps to meet the requirements around the globe? Our fourth pillar is infrastructure. You which ties a little bit to compensation in terms of it's the facilities they live in, but also, most importantly, the facilities they train on. And then the last pillar is a modernization pillar. And if those pillars get out of alignment, where you have too much in compensation and too little in modernization, you in fact do not have a ready force. And so if in fact what they're about is readiness of the force and taking care of the force, we ask them to view it through that lens. That's had some impact. At the end of the day, they get reelected every 2 years on what they bring home. And sometimes those decisions are made differently. And that's probably the best way I can describe it. Sir.
I had the pleasure of going up with General Thiessen, one of your predecessors.
A smart guy that had my job before me.
Right, and he left.
And that's why he was smart.
He went to Hawaii to pay the Pacific Command. Okinawa.
Hey, look, they're training people to do the right thing, and this is going to be an ongoing drama. But my question was this: he said to Mr. Hale, Bob Hale, and he said, you know, I want to do the audit, and this is something I worked with Mr. Cook, you know him, and
I do.
Mark Easton. And General Thiessen said, well, I know we're at war and we're doing all this, but it's going to help us on the Hill because it'll add to our credibility. And it really is something that the Marine Corps is doing something right for. And I'm just wondering, number one, how'd you make out for 2000 and I guess it was 11?
12.
Well, how'd you make out? And did it help you on the Hill?
It's helped us immensely on the Hill, and we should, in the next week or so, get a no-kidding audit opinion.
No issue.
An audit opinion.
They haven't set it out.
Whether it's going to be qualified or unqualified
Right.
remains to be seen. But a whole lot of hard work by a whole lot of great folks have got us there. It has added to our credibility, but more importantly, it's uncovered for us in our different, in the way we spend our money, where we had inefficiencies in monitoring that so we could shift money, money that was in fact inappropriately identified amounts-wise. We could shift obligations to places so we could utilize all that money most effectively. So we've grown tremendously internally. We continue to grow. We're now in the beginnings of the fiscal year 13 audit. But like I said, hopefully we'll have an opinion. The challenge here is we have an individual audit agency, Grant Thornton, who actually conducts the audit, who passes those recommendations off to the Inspector General, who then is overseen by GAO. So nobody wants to make too rapid a decision. Any other questions?
We have time for one more, please.
Shoot.
I guess two-part question. One, the President submitted a budget in 14 that does not account for the Budget Control Act. So we're back up at 527 or whatever total.
Actually, his budget does. If you take his federal budget writ large. So the Budget Control Act said, these are the cuts you're going to take. And in addition to that, this super committee has to figure out how to get an additional $1.2 trillion in savings over 10 years, or 9 years or 11 years, depending on how you read his speech. So the president's budget that he submitted, if you step back from defense, but look at it from the federal perspective, in his mind, that's why I say, he believes, as does the Office of Management and Budget, that budget solves the $1.2 trillion problem and therefore de-triggers sequestration. You are correct in that it does not bring DOD below the caps identified for DOD. But the caps were put in place in the event that sequestration had to be enacted and there was no resolution of the $1.2 trillion debt. It's a little bit of a complicated way to look at it, but he feels that from the federal perspective, he solved the underpinning of the Budget Control Act, and therefore there are no caps on DOD because he's got the entirety of the fiscal budget under control through raised revenues and other cuts. To the Department of Defense, about $120 billion, primarily in fiscal year 16, 17, and beyond.
Okay. So in light of that, then, Congress still needs to change the law, is my understanding, or in 14, another $52 billion will come out of the defense budget. Am I correct?
What will happen if we have, so this is a little bit tricky, but if Congress decides that this budget solves the $1.2 trillion problem and they pass this budget before 1 October, life is good, birds are chirping, the sun's out, and everybody is happy. If they don't pass this budget by 1 October, we will go into a continuing resolution. The continuing resolution will be this current budget we have, which was already sequestered at about 9.4%. We will take the additional, what rounds out to be about 8.5% off of that, and we will then operate under a sequestered continuing resolution, what we began with this last fiscal year. If they decide on a budget that doesn't meet the 1.2 trillion and doesn't meet the Budget Control Act, whatever that budget is will get sequestered at the difference between the caps and the budget that they determine. So it's a hugely complex set of outcomes, the best of which is we get a budget by 1 October, which hasn't happened in a while. The worst of which is, honestly, that we sequester the existing budget and have to operate once again in a period of uncertainty, taking money out of weapon systems procurement and training, mortgaging the future in order to pay for current revenues. So and the Congress is the one who approves, if you will, your point, by approving whatever that budget is. That budget is the approval document that either meets or fails to meet the Budget Control Act of 2011. And that's way too much stuff for an engineer to know.
We do have time for one more if someone else has one that they're ready to leap to their feet on.
Thorough briefing, sir.
All right, so, if you looked at our, we were looking at extraordinary national challenges and the ethical dilemmas of them. And as you talked to General Wissler about the fact that we have to look at this as shared pain. The parochialism, we're the only game in town, only the United States Marine Corps at the expense of all others in the rest of the nation. And it was uplifting to hear you talk about the fact that you're looking at it through that lens. I mean, there's always going to be service parochialism. We know and we understand that, but it shouldn't dominate when the nation's at risk. So, and thank you for this tremendous presentation. You get an option. Inside this folder, I have an 8x10 glossy of me in my combat uniform. In this bag, we have Admiral Stockdale's great book. So that proves you can get 3 stars without sucking up. So thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.